Racing across the open grasslands of Patagonia were three tourists on horseback as the sun shined brightly above them. One of the tourists, a kid named Samuel, came from a rich background, allowing him to travel abroad more often. His father owned property out here, and as such, he often came to visit here in particular, not far from one of his father's homes where he had horses and other animals. This time, he brought along one of his friends, a young man named Edmund, a mild-mannered kid who Sam, boisterous and pompous, had taken a liking to. Edmund didn't come from wealth and rarely got to take vacations, let alone coming all the way to Argentina from a small town in the southern US. While most folks saw Samuel as a dumb jock, the kind of guy you'd like to avoid, to Ed he was kind, caring, and genuinely helpful. He had helped Ed cover his last year of college when a scholarship fell through and didn't force Ed to pay him back either, despite the latter being willing to return the money when possible. Ever since, Ed had started a good job within the last few years, working as a video game designer, and had quickly proven his talents to the company. Sam considered it an investment well spent, and the two remained the best of friends. Their other companion was Ella, a young girl with a personality not unlike Ed's. She had been Sam's girlfriend in college, and they were still together and now engaged. Ella was from some money as well, but where Sam was the typical rich kid at face value, Ella came across as kinder and more humble. Most folks wouldn't guess that she was from wealth. At least not until they saw her riding across the plains of Patagonia on a random Tuesday in the middle of February. They were at the Torres del Paine National Park, and here in Patagonia, summer was in full swing. It was warm, but not too warm due to the wind, but the mountains sheltered this region from the worst of the wind. The Andes Mountains loomed over them in the east, snow-covered giants towering above a warm carpet of grasslands and forests, dotted with lakes and lagoons from millennia of glacier movements. Here, the trio were racing their horses, doing their best to outpace one another in a sort of mock contest. They were racing towards one of the bigger lagoons on an unpopulated side so that they could get an unobscured look at the landscape around them. There wasn't a ton of development here, but enough that they would still see people here and there. They crossed rolling hills full of small brush and tall grasses, still trying their best to keep to the designated pathways and trying to keep ahead of one another at the same time. Ella was the best of them, the most experienced of the group at horseback riding, and she was maintaining a steady lead. They couldn't hear much over the sounds of their horses as they continued onwards, with the crest of the hill they were racing towards just in front of them. As they began to get closer and closer, Ed was starting to catch up, but not quick enough. Ella was going to win. But suddenly, a loud, shrill, shrieking noise caught all of their attention, but Ed was still too focused on the race. The noise was carried through the hills, and Ed was the only one not to fully stop. Ella and Sam both got distracted, slowing down and even stopping a bit and allowing Ed to be the very first one to reach the hill. As he reached the top of the flat hill, he was greeted to a gorgeous sight of a vast hilly area covered in plains and shrubs, with small patches of trees giving way to forests in the northeast and small to large lagoons covering the landscape everywhere. Racing up behind him, the other two seemed a bit huffy that he had taken the lead. "You sneaky jerk," Sam said, riding up. "You didn't slow down with us." Ed couldn't help but smile. "That wasn't part of the race. The only stipulation was to get here first. I win, and you two are cooking tonight, Sammy, my boy." Normally, Ed is fairly shy, but with Sam, it was different. He was his best friend, and he didn't feel the need to be formal.
"You know, I would have won,"
said Ella as she caught up to the boys.
"You just got lucky. I don't know what made that sound, but it sure saved your butt."
She huffed that last part out, exasperated. "I wonder what made that sound," Sam said.
"Why don't we take a look around and see if we can't find out?"
The tourists took out their fancy cameras, one loaned to Ed by Sam, and began to gaze over the lagoon and look all around. In the sky above were several types of birds, sometimes coming to the ground for food or rest. A group of short but large flightless birds were drinking from the lagoon and relaxing nearby, and a name came to Ed that he couldn't quite place. A bird that looked somewhat familiar with a pointed and red head flew off towards the forest, and several birds of prey circled the dry grasses below, and one bird that even the tourists recognized, an Andean condor, soared high above them towards the mountains. But there weren't just birds. A lone gray fox wandered around the side of the lake, clearly looking for food, slowly prowling and sniffing along the brush near the water's edge, too small to take on the flightless birds nearby. There was a small group of what appeared to be a type of deer, but not one any of them had ever seen before. The herd of deer was small, not even a full dozen, but they were a dusty brown color, perfect for blending into the landscape. A pair of skunks were right beneath them, a ways away from the water's edge at the foot of their hill, walking towards the water. "Well, it looks like the skunks are the actual winners," Sam said, pointing down towards the animals and smiling. They all got a good chuckle out of it and kept looking around when Ella noticed to the right a herd of animals that looked similar to llamas. There were quite a few, maybe more than 20. They were slightly shorter and not quite as bulky as llamas were, and most of them were light brown with a pale underbelly. The animals were rushing off up the hills to their right-hand side, towards the forest nearby.
Those are guanacos. They're similar to llamas, but I think they're more wild than anything else.
Ella said this matter-of-factly, and it was Ed who spoke up next. "You're right. Llamas are only a domestic animal. They don't exist in the wild outside of farmers who live in these wilder areas. Same with alpacas. Funny enough, the guanaco is actually the ancestor of the llama." "Hey, nerds!" Sam spoke up, cutting off their conversation. "Answer me this. Do they always normally run full sprint like that?" Ed and Ella looked towards the herd running off and realized that no, they didn't usually do that, at least at the sign of humans. They thought about it for a moment when Ella finally spoke up again.
No. Come to think of it, that shrieking sound we heard earlier, it might have been one of these guys.
She sounded nervous as she spoke.
Those guys are the biggest prey around for miles. This park is the home of cougars. I bet you guys that a cougar caught one.
As she said it, she snapped her fingers, like the thought had just come to her. Sam smiled, as did Ed. "We'll have to try and keep her distance, but let's go see if we can find it." South America's puma, or cougar, was on the list for all of them, an animal who regularly stays well camouflaged out in these plains. They all wanted to see one and finally snap a picture of it. They began to circle the lake, making sure to keep a good distance from most of the wildlife so as to not spook them, or at least Ed and Ella did. Sam at one point ran over and began to bother the deer near the lake, yelling and riding close, scattering them and causing them to go around the lake to avoid the group. "Come on, man, don't do that. Leave the animals alone," Ed complained out loud. Sam just kind of chuffed and laughed, catching back up to his friends. As the group continued to circle the lagoon, they approached the spot they saw the guanacos coming from. Suddenly, while Ed was watching, the deer suddenly looked over at the group from across the lake and took off in the opposite direction, bolting away. "Good going, man. You scared them all off." Ella scrunched her face in discomfort, looking up the hill they were climbing, and Sam shook his head, laughing as they watched the deer run away. Man, talk about a delayed reaction. Ella seemed nervous.
Let's be careful, guys. Cougars can hunt in family groups sometimes, and younger ones and their mothers may still try to attack us if we get too close, even by accident.
Ella turned around and began to watch behind her as they climbed up the hill. Soon she realized it wasn't just the deer, but now she couldn't see any animals at the water. Definitely the signs of a predator. She had no doubt that there was a puma up ahead. The group crested the top of this new hill and once again looked down around them. They were lower than they had been previously, with rising hills in the front of them, lowering ones to their left and the same on the right until it curved back up the way they came. The grass was surprisingly tall here, so far up that their knees were covered even on the horse, and it was eerily quiet. No sounds, really, other than the ever-present wind blowing past them and the telltale sign of leaves and grass. "Well, what now? They could be anywhere. Between the tall grass and hills, it won't be easy to find them and, not get too close." Ed said this as he turned towards the couple, and they both looked around for a moment in thought, trying to figure it out. They could see no sign at all, which could mean the cat had dragged its kill elsewhere, but it was Sam's turn to snap his finger, pointing towards the sky. "Aren't those buzzards or whatever? Scavengers? Condors." Indeed, there were now 3 Andean condors circling overhead not far away. "So they want to eat whatever's out there, which means that that's probably our location." Samuel smiled again as he spoke, and he began to run off towards that direction on his horse. They followed suit, following the curve of a larger hill as it ran towards several downwards depressions in the plains. They couldn't exactly see where they were running, but soon they came to the edge of another small set of trees, the tall grass running beneath them as well, and they all paused. There was no puma or cougar. There was no predator at all. There was trampled grass scattered in the patterns of the guanacos running away, but more than that, there were large patches flattened into huge, awkward shapes, as if the guanacos were larger, or perhaps if they moved while lying flat. Several of these patches were streaked with blood, and even one of the trees was a bit crooked, the earth beneath it disturbed. Sam, curious as he was, continued forward.
"Sam, stop."
Ella was speaking quietly, but firmly.
"We don't know what this is. Someone might have come and illegally hunted the guanacos. This is a protected park. They might hurt us if they catch us."
As she spoke, she looked around nervously. It was even quieter here, the birds still circling overhead. But Sam didn't listen, and Ed found himself wishing he wasn't here. He didn't like this at all, but he followed his trusted friend forward, with Ella not far behind, not wanting to be left alone with this mystery. Sam reached the first of the large flattened patches, looking almost as if someone took a giant spoon and pressed the grass into smooth, curving shapes, like half circles, but erratically placed. There was a trail through the grass, too large for a single guanaco and probably even multiple. Maybe it was from the whole herd. Sam continued on this trail with the others in tow, and they came to another flattened area. Here, buried in the grass, was the limb of one of the herbivores, with their fluff dotted all around. The limb looked like it had been torn clean through, its bones crunched and savage, like a machine had broken it. The flesh was ragged around the edges of the wound, definitely not a clean cut. Ella went pale at the sight and looked towards them.
Guys, I really think we should probably head back.
Once again, she had an edge of nervousness to her voice. Why? It clearly wasn't people that killed it. Poachers wouldn't just leave that lying around. Whatever it is probably left it behind because it didn't see it. So it's just an animal. Maybe a cougar ripped it off. Sam spoke excitedly and not in the same quiet tones as Ella, but Ed spoke up now, clearly uncomfortable himself. Hey man, I want to see a puma too, don't get me wrong, but I don't know. That doesn't really fit their style any more than it does a poacher. Maybe Ella's right. But Sam was already riding forwards, going towards the tree line and following the trail. The others reluctantly followed again, passing more bloodstains and flattened grass as the trail led towards the trees, then to the right. They passed another large area with no blood that continued to the trees. As they approached the last patch of flattened grass, they could see the trails the guanacos had taken to escape. Rather than the one large trail that they had all been following, these were thin trails, perfect size for a single animal. Ed looked behind them and he realized the same. The paths behind them were smaller trails, veering off from the main, and even when they converged, they didn't get much wider and stayed almost separate. Ed now fully agreed with Ella. Something wasn't right here, but he still kept following Sam out of instinct. This last patch had another large splash of blood, this time with a trail. The trail went off into the woods, with the same large path disappearing behind some trees beyond their sight. Sam got off his horse and, taking out his camera, started snapping pictures. Suddenly, Ed thought his camera was way too loud. Sam started following the blood trail, looking up in the trees to maybe see the big cat that they were all after. But the blood didn't lead to the trees. It went further along the trail. Eventually, Sam turned left and stopped, right before the tree line, which was to Ed's left side now. Sam, my guy, please. Something really ain't right here. There's no sounds, no animals, except the condors up there. We need to go. Sam said nothing, but reached down and pulled up what appeared to be the top half of a guanaco's head. He walked back over to them, holding it up by the ears. They could see it clearly, and Ella just seemed queasy now, and even paler than before. Still dripping with blood, it was missing its jaw and the lower half of its head, just the eyes, nose, and ears still visible. Ragged and even rips accentuated the skin of the head, which looked almost as if it was squished inwards, as if hit with some powerful force. It looked as if the bottom was torn away.
Babe, we need to leave. Now.
Ella seemed almost unable to finish her words before she seemed to get sick again. But guys, this is a huge mystery. Imagine if we solved it. I don't think a cougar could do this, so maybe it's some kind of undiscovered species? Or look at the way the head is. Maybe poachers ran the animals over? That could be why the stuff is torn apart. A car hit him. Sam spoke loudly, and he was smiling, as if it was the cleverest thing anyone had ever said. Ed looked backwards again, thinking about the leg. You know, that ain't the worst explanation, but I don't know. We didn't hear any cars or see any, not for a few miles at least. I think we would have heard if they were running over guanacos in their car, you know? Finally, Sam at last seemed to consider that. Huh, good point. But still, he seemed not the least bit nervous. Well, maybe it's a caiman? South America's full of those, right? Well, yeah, there are plenty of caiman in South America, but ain't none of them live here. After staring at the head for so long, Ella finally hurled, unloading into the grass. Again, this seemed to get through to Sam. Oh, babe, I'm so sorry. He tossed the head into the woods, where it smacked against something wetly, and he seemed genuinely upset at his own actions. I just get excited. You know how I am. Ella just shook her head, wiping her mouth off with her sleeve.
We can talk about this later, babe. Please, just get back on your horse and let's get out of here.
Okay, alright, I'm sorry, you two, genuinely. Once again, he was still speaking too loud for Ed or Ella's liking. Come on, let's get on home and get something to eat. But Sam didn't get to finish his sentence. It all happened too quickly. A ringing sound began in Ed's ears as he felt the blood rush into them, and he barely registered the sound of the grass shifting behind the trees nearby, the crack of branches as it moved around the trees and into the open towards them from the left. A massive shape charged outwards from the trees, a blur of movement, but Edmund got the impression of a giant set of jaws, stout musculature, and a pair of horns, as if the devil itself had appeared out of nowhere. Sam didn't even get time to scream. Ella and Ed watched as he was ripped off his horse bodily, the poor animal almost falling over before bolting off into the woods itself, and both Ella and Ed's horses reared back and gave a scream of their own. Both people were too stunned to speak, to move. The ringing in Ed's ears continued as he stared at this thing as it spun itself in the grass, almost like a sports player, using its tail to shift momentum and turn itself around almost 180 degrees. He watched the grass become flat, realizing that this was the culprit. Its turning had flattened the grass. A dinosaur. It paused to look at them, and he got a much clearer picture. It was huge, standing a bit taller than their horses, and it was over double the length. Its body was round, but not overly so, not unlike the horses themselves, covered in orange and black patches of scaly flesh. Its legs were enormously thick and muscular, but its arms were incredibly short, tucked at the animal's sides, almost comically small. It was ragged with healed scars on its torso and legs, and there seemed to be barbed wire wrapped around its tail. But its head was horrifying. Two yellow eyes stared at them, with a pair of large, curving horns pointing towards the sides like a bull or a buffalo. Its head had a black blotch of scales covering the top around the horns and the eyes, fading into orange as it approached the jaws. At the jaws, Ed's heart skipped a beat. He could see the teeth of the animal embedded within his friend's torso and belly. But the worst part was that right now, Sam was alive. The ringing got even louder in his ears as he watched the legs of his best friend kick, his arms flailing and batting the sides of the animal's head, blood already dripping from the wounds, and Ella screamed. Ella's eyes rolled back and she fell unconscious, falling off her horse as the dinosaur began to shake its head side to side rapidly. Everything once again seemed to move in slow motion. Ed knew he had to act fast. He jumped off his horse and grabbed her horse's reins, keeping it on his right-hand side. He grabbed Ella, but he wasn't the strongest guy overall. He did his best to lift her off the ground and sling her over his horse eventually after what felt like minutes. Glancing back at the animal, and he almost passed out himself. He watched the animal shake, thrusting its head forward to stuff more and more of Sam's body into its mouth, and he watched as Samuel's leg, his best friend's leg, flew off his body through the open plain as the animal bit down hard during its shake. Sam wasn't moving anymore, but Ed was. He leaped back onto his horse and turned away from the animal, forcing the horses back towards the right, back the way they came. He knew he could no longer save Sam. Not now, and maybe he couldn't have at all. He didn't have time to think as the horses began to run furiously, not even being directed by him, just pointed in a direction. As he looked back, the animal lifted its head in the air and finished swallowing Sam before it disappeared behind the hill as the horses continued to run. Ella was still unconscious in front of him, and he was doing whatever he could just to keep her on the horse. He was focused on getting back to civilization, towards any help that they could find. But that's when he heard it. The footsteps, and he looked back behind him and he wished he hadn't. The animal was giving chase, its jaws bloodied with his friend's inside, and was running furiously behind them. Its loud footsteps echoed in his ears, and the animal let out a blood-curdling sound. Not a roar, but more like a low, rumbling hiss, not unlike an alligator. It seemed to swim in the grass, and the horses seemed unable to reach their full speed here, impeded by the stiffness of the grass itself. The predator's weight offered it no such disadvantage. He was gaining on them. He looked forwards and saw the hills that they had come from earlier, the ones overlooking the lake, and he went straight for it. Maybe the horses could outrun this animal on the open field where the grass was shorter. He glanced behind him again, and the dinosaur was less than half a mile back and gaining on them rapidly. He drove the horses as hard as they could go, not that they needed encouragement, but he was trying everything. But then, he broke free of the grass, the horses bolting down the hill towards the lagoon. For a moment, he felt free. On one side of the lagoon was now another group of tourists in a large vehicle, but Ed couldn't focus on that because as he glanced back, he saw the animal was almost on their heels, itself breaking free of the grass and almost jumping down the hill after them. As they approached the water's edge, he had only one idea left. Approaching the water, he let go of the reins on Ella's horse and kicked it in the side, causing it to bolt away from him towards the right. As it did, he turned his reins hard left just as the animal was behind them. His horse almost skid across the ground, but it wasn't long before it was bolting again towards the left, the way Ed and the others had come originally. He glanced back and saw the dinosaur try and snap at both him and the other horse, before itself sliding and tumbling into the lake with a splash. As he was watching, he saw the truck turn itself away and begin driving as fast as it could out of there. He continued to push the horse as hard as it could go, but he saw that it was tiring, and he could hear it panting as it ran. He had hoped his trick would be enough, but when he turned to look back, the dinosaur was already on them again, the water rippling where it recently burst free to chase again. For whatever reason, it ignored the other horse in favor of them. Just their luck, too. As he crested the hill they had first raced to, he realized the horse was indeed faster than the dinosaur, pelting much more rapidly on this open terrain. The dinosaur was no slouch either, but he could see that they were slowly gaining on the creature, slowly pulling away. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. Already the horse was slowing, but still barely outpacing the predator. That's when he had another idea. He veered towards the forest to his left, the one the guanacos had fled to originally. His horse was still panting, but it was their last hope, and one miracle did happen. Ella woke up.
Ed, what's going on?
She yelled it as he helped her sit up, still glancing behind them at the dinosaur. They were not far from the forest now, but the dinosaur was starting to gain on them again. "Look behind us," she did, going pale again, but not passing out. "Look, I know, but we've only got one option here. We gotta get to one of those big trees until help comes. When I say you jump off the horse and climb as fast as you can, you understand?" The wind was ripping past them, and she simply nodded in agreement. They continued to approach the trees and passed beneath the first of them, the dinosaur now only a few hundred feet behind them. He slowed the horse just enough before shouting, "Now!" as loud as he could, and both him and Ella diving off. The horse continued to run and the dinosaur chased it, perhaps not realizing they had jumped off as the pair tumbled into the dirt. Ella had scrambled to her feet, helping Ed up as they watched the chase continue. The pair found the tall tree that they had seen a distance away and began to climb. Ed was not much of an experienced climber himself, but Ella had gone out with Sam enough that she had some experience. She helped where she could, and as they approached partway up the tree, they heard the horse shriek, and they knew the dinosaur had gotten its prey. As they reached as high as they could go, some 50 feet off the ground by Ed's guess, they could sure enough see that the dinosaur had brought the horse down. It was standing on the horse's body with one leg, biting its neck multiple times with its jaws before the horse finally stopped moving. The dinosaur and horse couldn't be more than 100 or 200 feet away from the base of the tree, but it wasn't focused on them. Not now, as it began to tear into the horse.
Ed, what do we do? I don't know if I can.
She began to cry hard, with Ed bringing his pointer finger to his lips, reminding her to cry as softly as she can. But he began to cry as well, the realization of their friend's loss finally hitting them. He did his best to stifle them both, but he was sure if the animal wasn't so engrossed in its meal, it would have noticed by now.
We need to get out of here.
She looked directly at the animal as she said that, and Ed spoke up himself. "We can't leave yet, and if we do, we don't know if that thing will attack again. We have no hope of outrunning it without the horse."
What do we do? Just sit here and wait for someone to show up and save us? Who even comes prepared to save someone from a dinosaur?
Ed sighed, knowing that she was right, but what else could they do? Their phones had been left behind when they had started horseback riding, wanting to enjoy the day or whatever. Ed cursed himself now for agreeing to it. "Ella, listen, we either leave and take the risk of it chasing us, or we wait, and maybe it'll leave or someone will come and help us. It's your call." It would still be another 3 or more hours until nightfall, and in that time more tourists may come and help, or perhaps the animal would get bored and leave eventually.
Let's wait. You're right, we have no idea. Most predators don't want to attack or abandon their kills, but we have no idea what this thing will do. It's a damn dinosaur. Let's see if it leaves or if we can get help.
She remained strong for a moment, but it wasn't long before she began to cry again, and so they waited. Both of them took up separate branches and waited, cried, waited some more. Eventually, after what felt like hours, as the sun began to set, the animal stopped eating. It walked over to their tree, and they both held their breath. It began to rub the sides of its body against the tree like a bear or a moose, scratching itself. It rubbed its bloody jaws into the grass and dirt, mostly cleaning them off. It went back over to the horse and dragged it towards another tree not too far away, dumping the carcass there. It circled a few times afterwards as the sun began to set, curling up alongside the corpse and yawning, bits of flesh still in its maw. It laid its head down and closed its eyes, and he prodded Ella. "Ella, it's going to sleep." She looked at the animal, but without saying anything, she simply shook her head. She pointed towards the lagoon as the lights began to shut off and the few cars and people that they could see in the distance were leaving. He sighed, knowing that they would have to wait until morning to even attempt to find help, otherwise they'd be wandering the plains all night, possibly into the morning, and they didn't know how long this animal would be around. And so he braced against the tree and watched Ella do the same as he let his exhaustion overtake him, falling into a deep sleep. When he next awoke, the sun was bright in the sky. He glanced around, assessing where he was before remembering he was in a tree, and he scrambled to hold himself steady. He looked around, remembering the previous day's trauma and glancing at Ella as she still slept. He looked at the base of the tree and saw nothing but the horse's body, no sign of the dinosaur. He kept looking, and just beyond the forest, back on the grasslands, was the guanaco herd, standing alert but not doing anything but eating. And among them, he saw Hope. One of the other horses that had run away yesterday was standing among the guanacos, grazing peacefully, unaware of its friend's body lying nearby. He acted without thinking. "Ella, look! A horse!" He realized he said it too loudly too late, and then he felt the tree shake. He looked down, and once again, there it was. The same animal, the black around its eyes contrasting the yellow. He knew it was an animal, but he swore there was malice in those eyes. It lowered its head again and charged forward, slamming into the tree, and Ella woke up screaming. "Hold on!" he shouted as the animal charged again, shaking the tree entirely. He could feel himself shake and slip with every movement. The animal charged again, and it wasn't he, but Ella, who slipped from her perch, hitting several branches before finally managing to catch one and holding on. He panicked internally and began to climb down himself, trying to help his friend as best he could. The animal charged again, almost knocking him out of place, but he kept going. As he was only a few branches above her, the tree was hit again, causing them both to slip and fall downwards. They were now only 20 feet off the ground, only about 10 feet above the dinosaur itself. It looked up at them and looked almost like it was wagging its tail as it charged forwards again, shaking both people loose just a little bit more. He made his way to Ella finally and reached out, seeing that she was once again slipping, no branch to save her underneath this time. The dinosaur opened its mouth and let out that low rumble again, but the rumble was answered by a growl. It turned to look, as did Ed and Ella as they clung to the tree, to see a pair of pumas standing on the body of the horse. However, it was clear that they were not aware of the predator who actually owned it. The dinosaur turned to see the cats and immediately roared and chased after them. Its tail slammed into the tree as it turned, causing both of them to lose the last of their grip and fall down to the ground. Both got up as quickly as they could, and Ed turned to her as they saw the dinosaur disappear. "Run!" That was all Edmund said as he took her hand and began leading her towards the herd of guanacos. The llama-like animals turned towards them, alert, as they burst from the forest as fast as they could. The guanacos didn't run. These animals were used to seeing humans, even if they were running at them full sprint. The horse didn't run either, just blankly staring at them as they pelted towards it. The animal roared again in the distance, and the roar was enough to send the guanacos running just as they reached the herd. The horse was clearly nervous from the roar, but they dove straight forward, and Ed helped Ella onto it before climbing on himself. The animal was stubborn at first, not wanting to listen, but Ella took the reins forcefully, using her training to get the animal to comply. "Use the guanacos as cover," he shouted, pointing towards the animals fleeing back towards the park center, where the horse trailer and, more importantly, Sam's truck still sat. Thankful that Ella had a spare set of keys, he believed that they were home free. The horse immediately began to set off. But then he heard it, the dreaded thumping of the creature's footsteps. And once again, it all happened way too fast. As they began to ride, it once again attacked from the sides. As if in slow motion, he barely turned in time to see the flash of teeth and horns as he watched the jaws of the animal close around his own body. It felt as though he had been stabbed with a dozen hot knives at the same time, each tipped with serrations as they began to shear through his flesh as if it were no more than a chew toy. He watched as he was pulled from the horse, Ella trying to grab a hold of him, but his fingers slipped through hers as the dinosaur slid to a stop, holding him sideways in its mouth. He watched as Ella's eyes swelled with tears as the horse moved away from him. He could see each blade of grass as it flew up from the horse's hooves pelting away. He could smell the decaying hot breath of the animal, the smell of rotten meat filling his senses. But suddenly, he was filled with rage. The dinosaur lifted its head, forcing him to fall farther into its jaws. As he felt its jaws slam shut around him, loud cracks could be heard within him, certainly damaging his organs and bones. But he summoned the last of his strength for one last attempt. He lashed at the animal's eye, digging his thumb in as hard as he could. He could feel the wetness of the eye and watched as blood burst beneath his fingers, the eye itself popping. The animal rumbled angrily with him in his jaws, and he felt them open and then close again, and again, and again, and suddenly he was falling. He hit the ground on his back, and he barely had enough strength to look at his own body, realizing that the dinosaur had bitten him in half. As he reached for where his legs used to be, he looked up at the dinosaur as it swallowed the lower half of his body, his own shoe falling beside him as his legs were consumed. His arms collapsed at his sides, and his body finally gave out as he watched the dinosaur approach him again. His face fell sideways, and the last thing he saw was Ella and her horse pelting away as the jaws of the dinosaur closed around his face.